Hi, this is Robert Shear with another edition of Sheer Intelligence, where the intelligence comes from my guest, in this case, Richard Silverstein. And we're going to be talking about controversial stuff here about Israel and all that. And he's somebody that has really quite a record of covering events in Israel, writing about them in his blog, Tikkun Olam. And I always wondered, where did he get this knowledge? He's fluent in Hebrew. He seems to know quite a bit of Yiddish, at least from my exploring it with him. And so I asked him about his background and how do you get to be an independent journalist? Well, he didn't just invent himself and he didn't just start this blog, which is quite provocative in what it reveals about the failings of media coverage and also introduce of Israel and Gaza war and going way back. But he actually prepared for this academically. He was a joint scholar both at Columbia and the Jewish Theological Seminary. He was an early believer, and his life in the state of Israel and what could, I guess, be considered liberal Zionism. And he also studied at Hebrew University and studied Hebrew literature and Judaism. And he has a master's from our rival school in Los Angeles from USC, UCLA, in Hebrew literature. And fortunately, he has a wife who's helped support him. I always wonder, how did people get to be independent journalists? And so this, right, he married well, not to somebody who had great wealth, but who actually works. I was in the same position for many years. My wife outranked me at the LA Times, so I'm familiar. But we're going to talk about heavy subjects. I don't want to try to make it a little light, introduce ourselves. I know I've talked to you before and done a podcast with you before, and I know that you're troubled about what's being done. Let me put it very bluntly, in the name of the Jewish people. I've always felt a personal connection whenever I think about, Israel's policies. My mother's Jewish, and my mother suffered anti-Semitism in Lithuania. That's why she came to the United States. She also suffered when she was opposed to the Bolsheviks at the end. So she was a political person who fled, like many Jewish people. She was on the left, but very independent, and so forth, and became a union organizer in the United States as well as a garment worker. And I grew up in a tradition of progressive Jews and poor Jews, this, and that was the reality. And my feeling is, I've always been very, particularly because I visited my German relatives and tried to understand World War II and so on. I've always been protective of a great, not only secular, but some people interpret the religion in a very progressive way. And basically, let me use a word that seems to stand in contradiction to the very idea of Zionism, which is cosmopolitanism. Jews were always accused of being cosmopolitan, not loyal to France when they were there, the Dreyfus affair, not loyal to Germany, where they were quite well accepted on a high level in Germany as opposed to Eastern Europe. I was always very proud of Jewish cosmopolitanism, Jewish sophistication, knew a lot of languages, had traveled because of the diaspora in so many different countries. My mother was fluent in Russian and in Yiddish and came from a long line of rabbis. So let me, first of all, ask you, because you've become kind of a pariah in certain quarters for having devoted a lot of time in the last couple of decades to actually raising some serious questions about what is Israel all about. And I want to begin with two aspects of the current situation that you've written about. One is about the Hannibal Code, and you started writing about that back in 2014, which is something that people don't imagine, that the Jewish state, in the form of its intelligence agencies or its army, might actually kill captured Jewish prisoners and so forth. I'm not going to distort this by oversimplifying. I'll let you do it. And the other is the question that's come up recently in the news, but also the question about torture. Now, in the United States, we can't say torture. You have to say enhanced interrogation, but the whole world knows it means the same, whether the U.S. does it or Russia or anybody else, and certainly in Israel. but it's come up in a really uncomfortable way of what's going on in the West Bank and Gaza, in addition to all the other uncomfortable things. So take it away and introduces these subjects, and also, what does that do to Jewish values?
Well, in terms of my background, Bob, I grew up in the same kind of house you did. My father and his family were New Deal Democrats going way back. And in 1967, when we there were rallies at UN Plaza for Israel during the Six-Day War, I was there, and that was my first rally protest that I ever attended that I remember. And ever since, I've been doing that sort of activism. But gradually, I turned from being a liberal Zionist and supporting Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. And we could talk about whether it is what kind of Jewish state it is and whether it is a democracy, but that's another subject. And gradually, I came to see that Israel was no longer a democracy, and that the version of Judaism that Israel represented was intolerant, was racist, and really it picked and chose the worst aspects of Jewish traditions in the Bible, and for an example, Israeli settlers now want to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque and build a third temple there. And they used to be considered totally fringe, weird people. Like Mayor Kahana was considered to be an extremist that wasn't taken seriously, and now they're actually praying on the on the grounds of the temple, and of course that erupts into Palestinian outrage, and that's what Israel has become. It's become a state that is a theocratic state in which the worst aspects of Judaism are imposed upon the state by settlers and people of that ilk, and now people who are ministers in the government as well. So that's why my view of Israel has become so critical, and why I now consider myself an anti Zionist, because I no longer find anything in the ideology that Israel represents that I can identify with or I can support. And I'm really embarrassed that the American Jewish community, and especially the leaders of the community and the groups like the ADL and the American Jewish Committee, are really totally behind Israel and everything it does, and they are just part and parcel of a Israel lobby political machine that promotes Israel, promotes in Congress the arms sales that Congress approves for Israel, and also tries to suppress speech that's critical of Israel on campuses, and all of the things that happened last year on campuses where at UCLA they called in the police and there were violent attacks by pro-Israel thugs. I mean, all of that comes from Israel becoming this far right extremist state that I can no longer identify with. And if you want to now go into the Hannibal Directive
Before I
and
go
interact,
to before I go to the Hannibal Directive, let me. I, I understand how difficult it's been ever since the founding of Israel to be critical of it. But nonetheless, for the longest time, you had a labor government, and I know because I went there at the time of the Six-Day War. I went into Egypt, and then I went over to Israel, and so forth. And the people that I talked to, and I interviewed, I think we've talked about this in the past. I interviewed some famous people, Moshe Dayan, Aaron, so forth, Nalon, others, and all of them I felt at home with as a sort of American lefty kind of guy. And I stayed on a left wing kibbutz, by Marseille, I think it was probably very similar to the kibbutz that was attacked on October 7th in the political outlook, Hashemir type situation, left wing Zionist. But even the people in the government and the people I talked to, I just didn't feel estranged from. And they said things openly. They said, if you come back in 10 years and we're still occupying this land, we'll have failed and I would not be here and so forth. And what everybody was cognizant of is the Palestinians had not attacked Israel. Since you brought up the Six-Day War, I mean, something left out of every discussion. How did Israel get to control Gaza, the West Bank, Golan Heights, and so forth? And everybody assumes that somehow they either got it originally, aside from a gift from God, as some claim, or but that it was part of the original Israel in 47, or they assumed the Palestinians attacked Israel. And my memory from being there at that end of the war, first of all, the person who took me in, maybe you met him, I think his name was Ibrahim Shabbat or something. He was a mayor of one of the towns in Israel. He had given blood to the Israeli army. You know, he was a Palestinian Arab, but he had given blood. He was a part of Israeli society. And then he took me in, and we had to go under the curfew or something to get in there. And, the Palestinian that I met in Israel, they were not against the state of Israel in a fundamental way. So you right now have described an Israel that is diametrically, I think, opposite to what Israel was at the time of the Six-Day War. Is it too simplistic to say the Six-Day War and conquest was the midwife to this transformation?
I think you're absolutely right. Because after the Six-Day War, that's when the settler enterprise began. That's when the movement called the Greater Israel movement, the Land of Israel movement started, which was a movement to not just settle the biblical homeland of the Jewish people, which they considered the West Bank to be, but to annex it to Israel, and to make it part of Israel itself. Even though there were Palestinians who were indigenous to the West Bank, they ignored that. In fact, 300,000 Palestinians on the West Bank were expelled during the Six-Day War, but that's another story. And they started in 1970, and they founded the first settlement in the West Bank. And they did it with the support of a labor government, which is important to note. So this morphing of Israel into what it's become now did start with the 67 war. There was this messianic euphoria when they captured the Temple Mount and when they captured Jerusalem from the Jordanian army, and people started to believe, even secular Jews started to believe, that we're on a messianic mission. You know, there's a prayer you say in sometimes for the state of Israel, which talked about the beginning of our messianic redemption. So even American Jews believed this about Israel, that it was on a mission somehow, a messianic mission. And that has become a extreme distortion. And if you compare the Israeli leaders that you interviewed in 1967 and their views and their social democratic sort of views of what Israel was then, now we have a state that is totally captured by Kahanism. Meir Kahane, if he had lived, would have become the prime minister of Israel. I'm convinced of it, because the ministers in the current government are Kahanists, and they support all of the mass violence in the West Bank. They support the genocide in Gaza. And that's what Israel has become. It's been captured by this extreme, violent, movement that is in favor of expelling all the Arabs, the Palestinians, from the West Bank, from Gaza, and annexing them to Israel. And it
Right.
has this viscerally hostile view to the entire Arab world.
Okay. But I have to jump in now and say this is not, well, I can't speak about Israel. I read, the left wing press there to the degree it's translated in English, and Haaretz and others. But I gather they don't represent much of the population anymore. Haaretz is a real old paper, though, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, it goes back to the 1920s, and it was founded by a German Jew, by the way, Schocken family, which published Schocken Press. You might remember that. And yeah, they were German Jews. They were liberal German Jews. And Haaretz has been almost the only liberal newspaper, certainly in the last 20 or 30 years, it's become the only one. Before then, there were some left wing papers associated with the left wing
Yeah, it
party.
cost me quite a bit of money. I think it's over $100 or something, but it's worth
Yeah,
it. I mean, they
yeah,
actually do what a paper should do.
yeah.
They're obviously Zionists. They obviously uh, support the state. It happened when I was during the Six-Day War. They had a statistic that some very large percentage of the officers in the Israeli army were from the kibbutz movement, even though the kibbutz movement, which mostly was left, I think, or secular, so forth, was only like 3.5% of the population, but they had something like 70% of the officers in the military, and it's just so odd. I mean, I look. At one point, I wrote a series for the LA Times about the Jewish life in Los Angeles, and we did a poll, and we did actually a national poll. It's very hard to poll the Jewish population because it's such a small percentage, but the LA Times put quite a bit of money into it. And I found then, and this was after the Six-Day War, maybe 10 years after, uh, nonetheless, the people we polled, the poll was done professionally, showed that they were quite liberal. And they all said yes, they defend, obviously, Israel's right to exist, something Kamala Harris stresses all the time. But on the other hand, they said, they want peace and they don't want to keep the land. Peace is the main thing. And they didn't have this messianic view that you have. This was American Jews. Now, I don't know the polling data now. I don't know how much of it is reliable, but I still get the sense from my conversations with people, who are Jewish. Some of my best friends, the old joke. But the fact of the matter is, they still hold to that. Just about as certainly as strong, if not stronger, than non-Jewish people. Is this not your sense? Do you think public opinion among Jews has changed in the way you described Israel?
I think that it has. I don't think it has changed to the degree that, for example, that people support my views. But I think that they're extremely critical of Netanyahu. But that's true also in Israel itself. I think that they're critical of the occupation on the West Bank, and they don't. They oppose the Israeli policy, which is not formally to annex the West Bank yet, but that's the direction they want to go in Israel. I think American Jews oppose that as well. I think American Jews are quite open to the idea of withholding arms to Israel as long as there isn't the war doesn't end. And there's a generational divide, Bob, between Jews. So the older generation has the kind of views you're talking about because they were raised with the pushka, with raising money for Jewish National Fund and supporting Israel, right or wrong, going back to what I talked about the Six-Day War and your experience there. But the polling, the Pew polling, Pew Research polling shows that the younger generation is totally alienated from Israel. And and
The
it's
total,
not that
this is the Jewish,
alienated from Israel, the
yeah,
young
but the
Jews, the
young Jews.
yeah, up to say 15 to 34 demographic. The feeling about Israel is quite hostile, but mostly it's that they're alienated from it and they don't care about it like the older generation did because they realized that if they cared, in other words, if they had my kind of views, they would have to be committed to rebut and to disagree and to argue with people about these sorts of views, and they just don't want it. There's so many other important things that young Jews want to do and want to be involved with, and they're just totally distant from Israel, and that's just really a bad outcome for Israel, and it weakens the Israel lobby as well, which has always been the strongest lobby in the United States.
It's an interesting question because you know, uh, I don't want to give up being Jewish. I do. First of all, even though my mother was Jewish, we were in a Jewish neighborhood. As I say, my Jewish part of my family was all killed, and so forth. I went to Lithuania to try to find them. I also went to try to find my German relatives to find out why they got caught up in this, the greatest madness in modern times, in this slaughter, genocide, and raised a lot of questions there. I actually had books published in Germany and did lectures and so forth. But I don't want to give up the Jewish because I think you give up the Jewish connection, you're giving up one of the great progressive traditions that humanity has had. I mean, if you look in country after country, if you look at the artists, the books written and so forth, certainly compared to the percentage of the population that is Jewish, the Heinrich Heiners, even though I think he converted at the end, but the Heinrich Heiners and everything were amazing, and they're all over the place. And like in one of the worst, well, plenty of bad things happened in the old Soviet Union, but forget Yudalama Peretz, my mother would quote to me, and all these people, Shalom Aleichem, and so forth, and so there is an incredible. In fact, you know, Jewish progressive writing, enlightened Jewish writing, the Hannah Arendts of this world and the Albert Einsteins of this world. And Einstein wrote on social issues and so forth, including defining himself as a socialist. And I think it was 1946, the Monthly Review. So that is an incredibly rich, wonderful tradition. And I remember as a kid, I got very conscious of being Jewish because I was accused on more than one occasion of having killed someone's lord. And I at first I didn't even know what they were talking about. Punched in the nose or pushed on a street or something. You killed our Lord. And so forth. And then I asked people about, the Jews are supposed to have killed Christ. Well, everybody forgets that was a view endorsed in some very respectable quarters. So the fight against that kind of parochial hate, informed hate, when you had it with Father Coughlin in the United States, had plenty of people, forced the Jewish people to become major advocates of tolerance, concern for the other. So it's no accident you had Goodman Schwerner in the civil rights movement in Mississippi. No accident that in fact, the rubric became, and this was true throughout the world, when you wanted to attack progressives, you said the Jews were all behind it or were involved. So that's why I like talking to you, because you are a kind of, I hope it's not a relic of that tradition, right? It's the attempt to have respect for universal human rights so that never again applies to everybody. Albanians, right? The Armenians, everywhere. Never again. What has happened now, it's now associated with an illegitimate, hate-filled crusade against people who don't have an army. It's bizarre. Is it not? You're a scholar. I'm trying to appeal to you as a scholar, seriously, rather than making rhetorical points or anything. It's to use a Yiddish word, it's a shanda. Is that strong enough? Is that a scandal? I don't,
Yeah,
yeah,
I
so let's talk about it. Let's take a little extra time. It's interesting. And then I'll get to the two subjects I want to end with. So let's try to do it in the next few minutes. But I just would like your summary of that point. It's not just that people have been swept, we're losing a major source of sanity and decency in this world by eliminating that Jewish consciousness, universal application of human rights.
well, I think everything that you said, I totally agree with. I want to add a point, though, that is, uh, I think what we need to move towards as Jews, as American Jews, is we need to create not only distance from Israel, but I think we need to divide us in a sense. We need to be American Jews with our own American Jewish religion. And we need to, if we have any association with Israel, we have to make it clear that we are not the same as Israel. I think what the Israel lobby tries to do is say that there's no difference between Israel and Jews. Israel encompasses the whole entire Jewish diaspora. Israel speaks for Jews, et cetera, et cetera. I think that we have to sort of kill that idea, and we have to separate ourselves and say that we don't speak for Israel, and Israel doesn't speak to us. And that's, I think, one of the big problems with American Jewry is that we are still wedded to Israel. Israel is our religion to a certain extent. And we
But
have so tied.
it's sacrilegious in the most profound way, uh, because the religion certainly denied that idea that you could make a decision as a human being to define the whole aspirations, the meaning. It's quite bizarre, is it not?
Well, I think that what's bizarre is the way that Israel has co-opted all of those sources and used the worst, the most aggressive, the most violent aspects of Jewish sources and said this is what Judaism is. And for you and for me and for most American Jews, Judaism is not, genocide in Gaza, is not $20 billion or $80 billion in arms being sent by the U.S. to Israel to kill Palestinians. That's not the kind of Judaism that I represent. The settlers and their attempt to annex and displace millions of Palestinians and just physically expel them, I can't see that as a Jewish value. So I feel the need to say American Judaism needs to stand on its own. We don't need to completely disconnect ourselves from Israel and from those sources which talk about Israel. But we
But
really have to separate from the hostility, the anger, the violence that Israel
yes, but
represents.
isn't this? We don't need you to say that, or from certainly I have no standing here. Isn't that what the religion was all about? Which was that's why you study Talmud. That's why, I mean, my mother used to be very angry with all of her male relatives who were studying all the time, and my mother and her sisters were working all the time, and so forth, including in my mother's case, making drapes for the Razwilli family that the Kennedys got married into later in life. They weren't Jewish, but you went there and you made the drapes, sewing all winter. But the fact of the matter is, that was a tension, actually. I remember with my Catholic friends growing up in New York. They had the Pope in Rome, and the Pope was an intermediary. The Jews didn't have that a Pope. I know. Sometimes I was told we're related to the Vilna Gaon, and therefore you're related to something of a Jewish Pope, but everybody denied that there is such a thing as a Jewish Pope. How did Israel get to be the Vatican? That is what I don't understand. It is such a fundamental. I would think you're the scholar on this. I'm not, but doesn't it kind of just on on the surface even suggest a contradiction with the religion?
Well, I don't feel there's a contradiction. I mean, if you look at the biblical prophets, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Amos, and people like that, their values are my values and your values. Their values are not the settlers. Their values are not for killing
I'm not asking
Palestinians.
you to disagree with the prophets. What I'm asking, and I have very limited education here, but I've talked to my share of rabbis over the years, most of whom in LA and other people like Schulweis and Rabbi Bierman and so forth were incredibly brilliant and enlightened and wonderful people. But I thought there was a thread running through the whole Jewish experience that people study Talmud, and I guess you could find this in the Jesuits and the Catholic Church, to try to figure out what is divine truth or what is to be honored. And yes, you have your commandments, but they're subject to interpretation. And there's just something bizarre, I think, about identifying all that with a state, with a political movement. But I don't want to take any
Absolutely.
more time on this. But I do want to get to the two topics that I want to discuss because I think they represent a serious concern for anybody who respects Jewish tradition, whether from a secular or a religious point of view. And there are two stories. I should have gotten to this much earlier. We'll take 5, 10 minutes to finish this up. One has to do with this Hannibal Code that you first encountered in 2014. Tell us about that. And that's the question of killing your own to prevent them from falling into hands that other people can use to harm you. And the other is torture, which again, I would think violates any conception of human rights by coming from any of our major religions. So let's take one and then the other. And I'll
The
shut up
Hannibal,
now so that you have the full remaining whatever time we have got.
Thank you. The Hannibal Directive was a code that the IDF developed during one of the wars in Lebanon, in which Israeli troops were captured by Hezbollah, and later Israeli troops were captured by Hamas in Gaza. And the IDF did not want the captured troops to fall into the hands of the enemy. And the reason for that was that any Israelis who would be captured would there would have to be a prisoner exchange, and they would have to release in Israel members of Hamas, members of Hezbollah, in exchange for the Israelis. And they did not want to release what they call terrorists back to their home countries. In Gaza, what happened in 2014 was that several Israeli soldiers were captured and being dragged into tunnels in Gaza and being whisked away so that they could be used in prisoner exchanges. In order to stop it, the IDF not only fired on the Israeli soldiers, it also completely obliterated the neighborhood in Gaza where the soldiers were being taken to. There was a massive Dresden-like attack on this neighborhood, and everything in it was obliterated. So the difference now after October 7th is that Hannibal was also invoked on October 7th. So when the Hamas fighters took over the kibbutz that you mentioned, an Israeli general ordered a tank to fire into a house that contained Hamas fighters and Israelis. And the tank shell destroyed the home and killed the family. Also, Hamas was taking Israeli hostages and driving back to Gaza in various vehicles and jeeps, and Israeli helicopter gunships, IAF gunships, fired directly on those jeeps, knowing that there were Israelis inside and killing them. Because again, they did not want Israelis to fall into the hands of Hamas. And the difference between 2014 and 10/7 is that these were Israeli civilians that they were firing on. So not only do you have a military code which calls for killing your own soldiers, but you now have a code that is expanded to also killing your own civilians. And that's, I think, what is even more profoundly upsetting, disturbing about the way in which Hannibal is being used right now. So that's pretty much a summary of Hannibal. And I want to add that on October 9th, I wrote in my blog that because hostages and Hamas were being mixed in the tunnels and they were holding the hostages with the Hamas fighters, that Israel would have to invoke the Hannibal Directive because it would have to kill its own hostages in order to attack the Hamas fighters. So that's very early when I understood that that would happen, even before anybody was reporting. And by the way, the stories that I just told you about the Israeli hostages being killed in jeeps and the helicopter gunships, that was reported by Israeli TV news. So you have officers of the IDF who ordered the attack or knew about the Hannibal Directive actually telling Israelis on their own media that this is what happened. And unfortunately, in the world media, this story has been reported, but not widely known. Not reported, I don't think, in New York Times and the Washington Post, but it's a story that really, really is important that it be told. Now, if you want to go back and talk about torture,
Just to
um,
summarize that, so you're saying
yeah.
this affects the number of casualties that occurred and so forth? You're saying
Of the 1,200 people, Israelis who were killed, we don't know how many were killed by Israel. I've called for autopsies to be done on all of the 1,200 people so that you'd be able to tell what killed each person. And you'd be able to say Hamas killed such and such a percentage and the IDF killed such and such a percentage. But on no account do they want the public, Israeli or otherwise, to know how many Israelis were killed by the IDF. But my guess is it would be in the hundreds. I don't know what percentage it would be, but it would be a significant percentage because you've got helicopter gunships firing on these vehicles, and you've got the tanks firing the shells. So it had to be a lot of Israelis killed by the IDF.
So, and what you're saying then, if people want to question or challenge, so what you're saying is basically accepted now in the Israeli media?
Even Haaretz, which you mentioned, is reporting that the Hannibal Directive was activated, and it doesn't want to say that Israelis were killed in the Hannibal Directive. I mean, on 10/7 by the Hannibal. Well, actually, I think they have reported on the news reports that I mentioned to you. So they are acknowledging it. I don't think that the right wing Israeli media, which is most of Israeli media, I don't think that they are reporting on this very much because it reflects really poorly on Israel and its reputation. If the whole world were to know what the Hannibal Directive means on the ground in Gaza.
Okay, and subject number two, the question of enhanced interrogation, or otherwise known as torture, propping up. And this again, we're not denying that other governments, movements, terrorist organizations, and maybe Hamas itself, I don't know the degree to which they are accused or found guilty of torture. Maybe you could comment on that. But there are these disquieting reports of captured Palestinians, including in the West Bank, being tortured. And they do show up on Haaretz as well. And Israel IDF personnel conceding or exposing it. Yeah.
Well, I think that Israel has been torturing Palestinians and others for quite a long time. They torture them if they suspect that they're terrorists. They torture many just because they're activists, political activists, and Palestinian nationalists. So that has existed, but now we have it almost on an industrial scale. We have Palestinians in Gaza who were swept up in detention raids and brought to concentration camps, really, in Israel. And there they're tortured. There's one video where is the IDF soldiers who are torturing this Palestinian, raping him essentially, tried to shield themselves from the camera. They knew there was a camera, and they tried to shield themselves so you couldn't see what was happening. But the victim himself has described the torture. So you have the video showing the soldiers, and then you have the victim himself after he was released. These suspects that are being swept up in Gaza are not terrorists. They aren't armed. There's no proof that they, including the fellow who was tortured. And by the way, this raping, this is a mass act that the IDF is committing. Just incredible brutality. And you have some of the victims who survived talking about detainees that actually died in custody. So this is torture on a mass scale. And some people, this is controversial, but some people are comparing this to what happened to Jews during the Holocaust, the sort of level of brutality and violence on a mass scale. And in the West Bank, as you
We got to stop right with that sentence because
okay,
already we're violating every code of decorum, decency, logic, and so forth. My God, this is a blood libel, right? To compare to anything that happened in the Holocaust. So defend yourself. What is the evidence?
well, I want to say that in the Lancet and various other global public health experts have talked about the number of Palestinians killed in Gaza, and instead of the 41,000, which are now confirmed dead, the Lancet is one of the most prominent medical journals in the world, and two experts wrote that probably the total number of Palestinians who have been killed, and not just killed in combat, we're talking about killed by disease, killed by starvation, malnutrition, and all different forms of death of Palestinians in Gaza now is 186,000. You have another global health expert who said by the end of this year, she believes that the number could be over 350,000. So now you're really talking about killing on the scale of the Holocaust. It's not 6 million, of course, but it's killing on such a massive, almost incomprehensible scale that I think you have to look at previous mass genocides in history, and not just the Holocaust, but you could talk about the Armenian genocide, of course, you could talk about the Rwanda genocide. So I think it's in those, it now is entering history as one of those maybe 10 or 15 worst genocides in our, recent and last 100 years or so.
Right. And not to minimize that, but you were making a specific claim about torture, rape, and so forth. And you compared that to what had happened to Jewish prisoners of the Nazis. And so, what is the evidence for that?
Well,
And
I don't
how
think
would
that this is not like I didn't invent this charge. I think it's been used and leveled by many people, many experts, many scholars, many international lawyers, specialists in human rights, and even genocide scholars are now talking about Gaza being a genocide and comparing it to Nazi Germany. And so I wanted to also talk about the Nuremberg Laws. I hope we're not getting uh, um, uh, too deep in the weeds here. But if you look at
no,
the 18 different aspects of the Nuremberg Laws and then compare them to laws in Israel, there's really alarming matching of the content of the Nuremberg Laws with Israel. And if you look at Meir Kahane, who I said, by the way, Kahanism now rules Israel politically. Meir Kahane was an avowed fascist. You even have someone like Adolf Eichmann saying in 1938, if he was a Jew, he would be a Zionist. These are very disturbing things to know about history. So I think I don't make that accusation lightly, Bob. I know how fraught the Holocaust is for Jews throughout the world. But I also know how the Holocaust is abused by Israel saying we are the natural outcome of the Holocaust, and we will never have the kind of suffering that happened to the Jews of Europe. But the fact of the matter is that Jews in Israel are in more danger than you or I in the United States. And they're in danger because they've fallen prey to the Kahanist ideology. So I think that it's important that we look Israel in the face and look what it's doing and say the kinds of things that may be controversial about it, but say them because the world, I think, needs to know and needs to grapple with it, including Jews. I think we have to grapple with what Israel is and what it's become. It's done to the Palestinians what was done to Jewish victims of the Holocaust. It's the same suffering on the same level, my opinion.
so back it up.
Well, I just did in terms of the Nuremberg
Well,
laws.
no, no, I'm not baiting you now. I'm saying
Yeah.
one does not level a charge like that without devoting. I'm not asking you to back it up in the next 5 minutes when we finish here. But I think, yes, it's such a serious claim. It ought not to in any way be swept aside, but it ought not to be just used as a rhetoric or anything. It's very serious. And by the way, a claim that to me, as being an older person, I was born in 36, I never expected as a Jewish person to find myself in this position. It is so unthinkable that the people that I associate with, the people swept up in the camps and killed in the camps and so forth, who I think as a group, I'm sure they not were not all the same and so forth, but they were probably as decent and idealistic a group of people because of their experience, because of their having been persecuted, because of their having traveled, as probably ever existed. It's the way I think of my mother, for example. I mean, she suffered. She came over in steerage. She had a brass candle thing to prevent somebody from, she and her sister, prevent people from attacking them. They'd been attacked by the Cossacks. Their whole life had been threatened, and it turned them in, dare I say it, superior human beings. They sacrificed for others. You are now, uh, it's a showstopper for me uh, to consider this that you become. There are studies that show that the victims of extreme regimes then can become the Gestapo of a new thing. But this is exactly what I meant, taking it back to the beginning. When I talked, and including, wasn't just at the time of the Six-Day War, I talked to Rabin and Perez and something. They be in America, Los Angeles, not at great lengths, but I would meet these people, talk to them. And you know what? Okay, I'll actually end on this by recommending that people watch The Gatekeepers. I've said this before because this really gets to the point where maybe what you're calling Kahanism took over with the death of Rabin. Let's end it. Let's discuss that because up to that point, peace was a really an important option. Rabin, the old general, had embraced it. He then gets killed by a Jewish fanatic. And while he's not a leader of that movement, he's certainly emblematic of it. Let's discuss that because that is the critical juncture between a Jewish idealism and what you are now alluding to as a Jewish fascist movement.
Yeah. So the assassin of Yitzhak Rabin, that happened, I think, in 95, was Ygal Amir. And Ygal Amir was small potatoes. He wasn't a leader of anything. By the way, right now we have two ministers in the Israeli government who are followers of the movement that Yigal Amir was part of, which is this settler extremist movement willing to engage in mass violence. So, but Yigal Amir got the approval of rabbis to commit the assassination. And the rabbis, these are called settler rabbis, had this ceremony, this Jewish ceremony, in which they said it's permitted for a Jew to kill another Jew because that Jew they will kill is responsible for getting a large number of Jews killed. So they were saying, in effect, Yitzhak Rabin is killing or putting Jews in danger. Therefore, it is permissible to murder him. And that was what spurred Yigal Amir to commit the crime that he did. And that now, that ideology rules Israel. And that's what's so disturbing to me as a Jew. That's what's so disturbing to me, and I think you, as a member of a family where I had scores of my family killed in the Holocaust as well. I am I am disgusted that this ideology represented by Amir, now has taken over Israel. And what you can do now is they don't need to assassinate prime ministers because the prime minister is one of them. And now Kahanism, you really need to understand Mayor Kahana and maybe read his work to understand his links to Nazism, and a Jewish form of Nazism, which I would call him, and how that has captured the entire state of Israel. Even though you have secular Jews, which you talked about in the beginning, who perhaps disagree, but they don't oppose it in enough strength. They don't have enough votes to prevent these fascists, Judeo-fascists, I call them, from controlling the government, controlling the funds, controlling the building of settlements, controlling and funding the army, which is engaged in this genocide in Gaza. So that's what's so disturbing to me as a Jew. And I think probably disturbing to you as well. And that's why I'm prepared to say that this is, I call it a genocide. But to me, the Holocaust is genocide. So I think we're got to talk about them in the same context, even though they're different historical contexts. But I think you have to do that.
Well, that's a career ender, isn't it? I mean, the
That's why
point
my
is,
wife supports us.
yes,
I don't get a lot of income out of it, but I
no,
do.
but uh, if it's important, that is the oldest Jewish tradition. It has to be raised, right? If it's important, but the burden is really to make the case if it's true, and to examine it. So I do want to end this, but I want to applaud your applying. Get back to the fact that you actually studied this culture, this religion, and you, in a way, have not in a way, and you have devoted your life to really trying to figure out what it means to be a Jew, right? So this is the beginning. I hope for people listening to it of an investigation, of a study, which is what Jews should always be doing when it comes to deep moral questions. On that note, I want to thank you, Richard Silverstein. You can read his blog, Tikkun Alum, and want to thank the folks at KCRW, Christopher Ho and Laura Kondarajian, for posting these shows. KCRW, the NPR station in Santa Monica. Joshua Shear, our overall producer, who was, by the way, bar mitzvahed by Rabbi Bierman in a ceremony that very much moved me. I want to thank Diego Ramos for writing the intros to these podcasts, Max Jones, who does the video. I want to thank the JKW Foundation in memory of a terrific independent American writer and public intellectual who was one of the first prominent Jews, came from a very prominent Jewish family, and who, in her memory, they give us some funding for these shows, and Integrity Media, which supports dissent and in the world of journalism and ideas, for also helping. See you next week with another edition of Sheer Intelligence.